Thanks for that very nice introduction, Doris. I had the same reaction when I saw Bill Ayers being interviewed by Megyn Kelly. I literally flinched every time she said, but professor. Like, no, he is not a professor. He's been given that title, but he never deserved it. He is a fraud, an imposter, in addition to being a terrorist. So anyway, the clever title that I came up with for this talk was Days of... what is the title of this talk? Days of Age, right. It's from the title of this book that just came out, America's Radical Underground, the FBI, and the Forgotten Age of Revolutionary Violence, and it's by Brian Burrow. It came out last month, just a couple weeks ago. And I read it because it was about a topic that I follow, Bill Ayers and the Weather Underground, especially what they're doing in education. And I thought, well, it's about obviously the title comes from the Days of Rage, right, which was in, anybody remember, 1969 in Chicago, when the Weathermen decided to just attack police and rage through the streets because of the Chicago 8, those protesters of the Democratic Convention that were being prosecuted. So I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to look back at those radicals, which is what he does in this book. And what he basically says is that these people were protesting against a society that by the 1950s had become conformist and complacent. If you were talking about white America, people lived in the suburbs. The kids were growing up in pretty prosperous households. They had 2 cars, the suburbs, just the cliches about the 1950s. Well, that's a certain perspective. But what happened was when they watched images of, people, in the civil rights protests being, hosed down, and they became enraged and fought for social justice, and rightly so. I think we would all agree that it's wrong to discriminate against people because of their race or anything else, their ethnicity or their religion. And so that's the story. They became motivated by the injustices that they saw in this country that, were outside their, white, prosperous suburbs. And so they went to the South and started, becoming active. And, they formed the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. They started around 1960. 1962, they gathered in Port Huron, Michigan, wrote the Port Huron Statement, authored by Tom Hayden, who was one of the Freedom Riders. And so that is the story of the background. And I think it's part of the overall attempt to rehabilitate this cohort of people, which is what we saw being done on Megyn Kelly's show. When she calls him professor, Bill Ayers professor, we're supposed to think, okay, well, this is a title of respect, and so we should give him that honor. So this is basically the way that he presents this this generation, and especially this elite group of the Weathermen who came from upper middle class families. But the way he presents it, especially with Tom Hayden, and I think I'm right about this, but he basically says Tom Hayden was a freedom rider, and that's how he got into the SDS. And then the splinter group sort of broke off, and they decided things weren't moving fast enough, and we're going to start bombing, and we really need to stop these injustices. And of course, Tom Hayden wasn't with that group, but he says that Tom Hayden's motivation for joining the SDS was civil rights, and so was the motivation for all these other radicals. Black civil rights, he says, was the most important reason. I don't think that's true. I think that's part of the attempt to rehabilitate them. Tom Hayden was motivated by what he saw on campus, which was the fact that girls weren't allowed in the dorm rooms. I'm serious. I've read another history of the 1960s. Girls weren't allowed in the dorm rooms, and there were curfews. Okay, well, you know, I think that's sort of a timeless motivation for young people to rebel. So anyway, that's part of a different history I want to write. And I'm also, as I'm at the Alexander Hamilton Institute, I'm researching George Schuyler, who was a conservative black journalist and fiction writer who lived from 1895 to 1977. And there's an alternative history there. But anyway, this the sort of stereotypical view of the 1950s and 60s serves the purpose of this book, which is to kind of present the Weathermen as these people whose motives were good, but they were misguided and just didn't know when to give up. But now they've settled into retirement. They're loving grandparents, contributing members of society. They've pretty much given up on their radical ways, and I don't think that that's the truth. At least if you look at Bill Ayers' record, it's not the truth. One of the things that he has said during his interviews is that they really had no political effect. That what they were attempting to do with these bombings and attempted assassinations of police, which is what they in fact did at the beginning. I mean, later, Bill Ayers and Megyn Kelly said, we never wanted to hurt anyone, which was not the truth. But, I think also you kind of have to, take it with a grain of salt when you think about setting a bomb. There might be someone in the building, even if you're just trying to blow up the building. So he says that they really had no political effect, and I don't think that that's true. I mean, we can just go to the election of 2008, right? I think there was some political effect. There's the effect, of course, in the culture and in the educational system. So there was, I think, they had an enormous impact on our society. I don't think we would be where we are if it weren't for them. I think they made us a little more immune to violence, to protests in the streets, to destroying property, to hurting people. Okay, so that's going to be the first part. Then I want to get into how Brian Burrow treats my late friend Larry Grathwohl, who was an informant for the FBI. He was the only one to infiltrate the Weather Underground, and he actually saved lives by reporting on what they were going to do. Larry Grathwohl was a Vietnam vet. He was 22 years old, and he was going back to school, and he was on near the campus of the University of Cincinnati. He was between semesters, and he was approached by the Weathermen, and then he told his father-in-law that this is what they were doing, and his father-in-law, who was an ex-policeman, urged him to report on them, and he did that at the risk of his own life. He could very easily have been killed in the Weather Underground. They almost killed one person who was an informant. They found out someone who was an informant and beat him to within an inch of his life until he was rescued by a pastor. So I met Larry Grathwohl around 2007 when I started writing about Bill Ayers and what he was doing to education. I had gotten hold of a copy of one of his books, and I thought, well, this is just really outrageous, and I was sort of seeing what's happening in higher education and became interested. So I met Larry Grathwohl at a conference that was sponsored by America's Survival, and Larry was trying to get someone to listen to him about the lies that Bill Ayers was putting forth, because he knew Bill Ayers. And Bill Ayers has been given a stage, the New York Times, now on Fox News. He goes from campus to campus, talks to students, has book signings, gives speeches, and he continues to spread these lies. And Larry, being the good patriotic American that he was, just tried to get the word out about who these people really were. In 1976, he had published a book called Bringing Down America. It was a story told by Larry to Frank Reagan, who wrote it. It was out of print, and then someone we were working with, Tina Trent, republished it, and Larry and I were on tour in Florida in 2013 in May, and speaking to Tea Party groups and similar groups, trying to sell his book and to get the word out. We were going to continue doing that in the fall, but unfortunately Larry died that July. Very unexpectedly. He was pretty young, 65. So I'm going to get around to who Bill Ayers is in relationship to Larry in this talk, but I do feel a need to defend Larry, especially in terms of what Brian Burrows says in this book. He devotes pages to loving portraits of, say, Kathy Wilkerson, as who built the bombs on the West Coast and spent some time in prison, but she's now a grandmother, and he has this nicely etched scene where she's, lovingly wiping the mouth of her grandson, and he's doing all that, presenting, sort of the motivations, the love triangles, how attractive Joanne Chesimard was, and blah, on and on. But what he says about Larry, he puts in a footnote. He calls Larry, quote, a kind of conservative gadfly who regularly appeared on Fox News and other cable channels to talk about Bill Ayers and others he knew in the group. A kind of conservative gadfly, okay? The other people, are given special attention. It took 5 years to write this book. As far as I know, he'd never tried to contact Larry. I've talked to his daughter and Cliff Kincaid, and they said that, to their knowledge, he never tried to contact him. Ironically, that summer, as we were going and talking to Tea Party groups, and when we had breaks, Larry was reading a book called Too Close to the Sun, which is Kathy Wilkerson's memoir. And he'd come in to the house, and he'd be shaking his head. He could only read a few pages at a time because of all the lies in it. I think it would be worthwhile to have been able to have gone through that and said, okay, well, this is what Kathy Wilkerson, the bomber, ex-convict, is saying. Now, Larry, what do you think? Was it true that this happened? Okay, so to get back to point number one, was it true that there was no political impact from these people? As I said, no, we know from the election of Barack Obama that that's not true, and Bill Ayers was not just a professor down the street from him. We know that Ayers' first political campaign for state senate was launched in Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn's living room. We know from their years of work together on the Chicago Annenberg Challenge, which misused millions of dollars that were intended to reform education, to radicalize students. Okay, so they were working very closely together on that. And they were also working together with Arne Duncan, who is now Secretary of Education. So there is that connection there. We also know that Ayers and Dorn were on progressives for Obama. And we also know that Bill Ayers wrote an op-ed in the Huffington Post in 2009 urging President Obama to appoint Linda Darling Hammond as Secretary of Education. Linda Darling Hammond is on the same page with Bill Ayers as far as education philosophy goes. She's a very close colleague of his, and so in academic writing, generally you can tell, if people are co-authoring things, or I might edit a journal that, say, if Mark's an academic, that I'll publish his article and then I'll be published in his journal and so forth, and we're pretty much on the same page, and this is what the two of them were. She did not obviously become Secretary of Education, but she did devise one of the two Common Core tests. So there are two national tests for Common Core. She was in charge of that after being in charge of Obama's education transition team. Common Core. I've been sort of mocked for suggesting, that there are ties between Bill Ayers and the Department of Education. I wrote this long report on accuracy in media about how Bill Ayers was at this meeting with Arne Duncan, and Bill Ayers was giving a keynote address, and this was in Washington, D.C. in 2009, and there was, at least one representative from Achieve, which is the company that put together Common Core, and so, okay, well, no, that's just a coincidence. They happened to be at the same conference. But I've also been writing a lot about Common Core. Is everybody familiar with Common Core? Okay, all right, good. It's been a few years. I'm not sure. One woman, I mentioned it, and she said, "Well, I think tests are good. We should have standards." And I didn't realize that she didn't know that Common Core really is not about standards. But I think Common Core is intended to do the same thing that Bill Ayers wants to happen with education, and that is to ensure equality of outcome in terms of education. Okay, it's intended to keep everyone at the same level. No more A's, F's, no more grades like that. In fact, many school districts have stopped giving out those letter grades, give only three grades, and they're not the letter grades, they're some kind of descriptive phrase, right? So everyone gets a prize. Right? So it's also not so much about what students know, as this woman objected. She said, well, if I hadn't had that one-page test for chemistry, the teacher I had, I wouldn't have learned anything. So it's good that at least, I was able to demonstrate my knowledge of chemistry on that one page, or the questions they had there. But Common Core is not about that. It's not, there's a lot of testing, but it's crazy testing. It's not like you can get the right answer. So it's more about measuring your attitudes, children's attitudes. How well do they collaborate in groups? It's all about collaboration, right? How open are they to diversity? How tolerant are they? How good are their listening skills? How do they show empathy? Are they empathetic? Okay, not about knowing history or how to solve a math problem or understanding a great literary work, but it's more about attitudes. And and being able to get along with the group and understanding social justice issues and becoming a global citizen. And that is the agenda of Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers does not believe in any standards, so that conforms to what he wants. So we're seeing that in the Department of Education. The other way is what the Justice Department is doing through the Department of Education, where there is to be equality of outcomes, at least by ethnic and racial categories, when it comes to discipline. So they're clamping down on schools now, and if there are students who are disproportionately disciplined from the percentage of their ethnic or racial group, you have the Justice Department coming after the school doing an investigation. This is something that Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn have been campaigning for decades. They've been writing books about this, about juvenile justice. Bernardine Dohrn is described in various circles as a child advocate and so forth. As a matter of fact, the last speaking gig that Bill Ayers had at Pennsylvania State, I think it was in March, he was speaking to educators, and they have a lot of times these social justice centers on campuses now, which are part of the problem. But the topic he was speaking on was the school-to-prison pipeline. Everybody heard that term, school-to-prison pipeline? Okay, so supposedly there is a pipeline now. I'm not teaching anymore, but I go on a campus and you see these bizarre posters, and you try to describe this to the outside world. But no, there are frequent talks on the school-to-prison pipeline, and the theory to that is because people in prison were more likely to have been discipline problems in school and been punished, there is a direct path from school, bad schooling, to prison. So the schools are the fault or the reason why people are in prison, and specifically it's because of the discipline that they're in prison. So disciplining someone in school for misbehavior or violence leads to prison. Everybody get that? Makes sense. All right. So this idea of school as prison. The Weathermen, when they were around in the late 60s and early 70s, they went to high schools and they tried to recruit students. They told them they were political prisoners. Some of us may have felt like we were prisoners in high school. I don't know, I don't know if we would say we were political prisoners. But Bill Ayers, contrary to what this author might say, has not given up those old ideas, because in a book that he wrote called To Teach, which is still very popular in education schools, one of the most widely used books that teachers, future teachers are using, and now in graphic form for those who need help with pictures to read it, not that his prose is that difficult. In his book, To Teach, Bill Ayers says schools are prisons. Why are they prisons? Well, the bell rings, you have to change class. You've got a schedule. Okay? You've got grades. You have behaviors you have to adhere to. There are tests. There are dress codes. And so he is saying the students are prisoners. No change at all from 1969. None at all. And this is what future teachers are learning. So what I tried to do in my short book is to show that Bill Ayers did indeed use the college classroom to radicalize students. And as much as everyone is justifiably outraged whenever he's on a campus to speak because of his terrorist actions in the past, they should also be as outraged because of what he has done to education. And it's quite a slog to go through all his books. He's got a curriculum vitae that's over 40 pages long, and he's got all these books, and it's pretty much the nonsense of a stoned-out hippie. And he cuts and pastes, and he repeats phrases, but nonetheless, this earned him the title of Distinguished Professor of Education. What I've done is I've gone through his syllabi. He even has on his syllabi how America, spelled with a K, was this imperialistic nation, empire building, racist, capitalist, unjust, on and on and on. He said this on his syllabus, so you can imagine what conversations or discussions were like in class. And one of his favorite sayings is, education leads to revolutions big and small. And that's in his books, and he uses it in his speeches. So Bill Ayers did this in the classroom. In 2006, he traveled to Venezuela. He also went to Gaza in 2010, stirred up trouble there, anti-Israel, rhetoric, and where else? Oh, he recently talked to the Iranian news agency called the United States a terrorist nation. So he's still doing the political work, and he has more time for it now since he's retired. He retired in 2010. In 2006, in Venezuela, he spoke to the World Education Conference, and in front of Hugo Chavez, he called for a worldwide socialist revolution, and he called education the motive force of revolution. So let's look at the situation in Venezuela today. Is it a socialist paradise? Last I heard about Venezuela was they had a toilet paper shortage, right? That was a few months ago. And the president had to send in the National Guard to take control of the toilet paper plant because people were hoarding toilet paper. In Baltimore, and I don't know, this is maybe a peculiar connection, but I saw this sort of iconic photo of the riots and this man walking out of a burning, looted, I think it was the CVS with the giant, economy package of toilet paper. Okay, Bill Ayers in Venezuela, here we are in the United States, after the rioting, people are stealing toilet paper, okay. Well, we're not Venezuela yet, but, as Doris said, practice. He hasn't come to LA, this year, but, last year, Ferguson, and it's kind of moving around. But when I see pictures like that, and, I don't just make the connection to Bill Ayers in Venezuela, I also think about, who are these people? Why are they doing this? Right? What is the purpose? I mean, we think it's ridiculous to rush into or smash windows and grab, rolls of toilet paper. It used to be, appliance, electronics and maybe sneakers or liquor or something, but now it's, everything. I think they have been schooled in this ideology of protest. And, the idea that they are victims, that the United States is an unjust nation, and that they are persecuted and that they will never achieve anything because of the country that they live in. So they are given these hopeless messages. Okay, so that's what Bill Ayers is doing, and he's spreading this message, and it's not just that he's been doing it in an isolated school. In 2013, he spoke to the Association of Teacher Educators in Atlanta at the Hyatt Regency, and I went to that, and I just picked out a few sentences from his keynote speech. He said, "We are finite beings plunging through infinite space." Okay, it says, before education professors. "Every human being is of inestimable worth with a pulsing human heart underneath." That's pretty profound, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that's why we, pay for the education professors and teachers to go to these conferences to listen to this stuff. And then finally, he talked about his career, and he said, "Seeing kindergartners as three-dimensional human beings is a huge intellectual challenge." Well, I guess for Bill Ayers it is. He's also directed dissertations. I've gone through some of the titles. I'll just name a couple. Okay, these are actual titles of dissertations of education professors. These are, the people who've been trained by Bill Ayers. "Are You Mixed? A War Bride's Granddaughter's Narrative of Lives in Between Contested Race, Gender, Class, and Power." That's an education professor. Another one is "Nappy Roots, Split Ends, and New Growth, an Autobiographical Narrative, Inquiry into the Experiences of a Black Female Educator." Nothing there about, how do we ensure that students are able to read at their grade level at least? How do we ensure that they are knowledgeable about their country's history? So anyway, he takes his cue. He wants to use the classroom to tear down this country, to institute a communist revolution. That's still his goal. He's been saying that. He used the classroom for it. He follows in the footsteps of Howard Zinn, the late former member of the Communist Party, who wrote the best-selling People's History of the United States, which is widely used in classrooms, in colleges, and high schools. And Howard Zinn died in 2010, but he taught at Spelman College, was one of the founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So when I hear these histories about, these idealistic upper-class white kids went down to a black-led movement, I'm kind of skeptical because I know what Howard Zinn's done. But Howard Zinn said, real learning takes place outside the classroom, and so he meant protests. And Bill Ayers follows in the footsteps. So Howard Zinn was sort of the mentor to, he was from the old left, mentored the new left. And to get back to the sort of the history that Burrow presents, one of the essays that Howard Zinn wrote was in 1969. It was called "Marxism and the New Left." He says, "Marx envisioned the industrial proletariat as the revolutionary agent." And he said, we don't have the industrial proletariat, so in order to tear down the middle class of this country, which was the biggest obstacle, he said that the new left should go out and recruit students, and I use a quote here, "ghetto Negroes." And so those were the two groups to be targeted. It's explicit, and that's exactly what Bill Ayers was doing too, as well as the other Weathermen. Okay, so what does this most recent book about this time say about Bill Ayers? He says that he's perhaps the most visible veteran of the underground struggle. He's an active author and lecturer. At bookstores, young activists line up to have him sign copies of his book. And he says, quote, "Young radicals today may not agree with or be able to make sense of the idea of protest bombings, but many clearly admire the passion and extreme commitment people like Bill Ayers devoted to trying to change America for the better." Okay, and if they believe that, that's because they've been educated in our schools, which put out that narrative that he tried to change America for the better. Larry Grathwohl knew Bill Ayers personally, and he certainly knew that Bill Ayers was not trying to change America for the better. He knew Bill Ayers when he was National Education Secretary of Weatherman. And so Bill Ayers was the official spokesman. He was the one to deal with the press in the organization. And I've got a couple passages that I want to read from Larry's book to sort of illustrate the contrast between what Burrow thinks that Bill Ayers was and what Larry knew him as. Okay, so they were having a war council. So they were planning how they were going to and where they were going to conduct their bombings and doing strategy. And Larry was assigned the role of the person at the door checking IDs. And this is his first time he comes across Bill Ayers. And this is from the book. The first Weather Bureau person to show up was Bill Ayers. Ayers, the son of the president of Commonwealth Edison of Illinois, had been involved with SDS since 1963 when he entered the University of Michigan. He had a reputation for being radical and violent. He walked up the stairs pompously and started to pass by me. I held out my arm to block his path. He was a few inches shorter than me, but very broad. "What are you doing, man?" he snapped. "Where's your pass?" That's Larry. He tried to shove by me again, but I moved in front of him. "Get out of my way," he shouted. I didn't move. He was furious. "Do you know who I am?" he said. I pretended not to. "I'm Bill Ayers." I shrugged my shoulders. "You still need a pass." I was enjoying my work. I can tell you some other things that Larry said about Bill Ayers, but they're really kind of bone-chilling. This is a very good account of those days, and a contrast to, the way it's presented in other accounts. Grathwold also describes that they were going to take in Detroit. So Bill Ayers was the one who sort of said, "Okay, you're going to this city. You're going to this city. He was like the one giving out orders. They were going to Detroit because it was seen as a place of oppression of blacks. So they had a meeting at Wayne State University that Bill Ayers was presiding over, and so they had people calling out, reasons for attacking in Detroit. So they're trying to, gear themselves up and justify what they're going to do. Of course, it was the corporate headquarters of General Motors, and someone shouted out, "GM is one of the largest, racist, capitalistic pig companies in the world. Its only black employees are on the assembly line working like slaves." Bill Ayers liked the idea that was suggested of attacking the police commissioner because there was three policemen were accused of abuse, and it was going to trial. So they decided to bomb the Police Officers Association building in the 13th and a precinct station house. And so they were set to do this, and Larry Grathwold, because he'd been in the Army, was thought to have this expertise in bomb setting, so they looked up to him and thought, well, he knows about explosives. Okay, so this is how he describes the plans for bombing the Police Association building. The plan we worked out was actually quite simple. Two of us, a male and a female, would attend the late evening show at the movie theater around the corner from the police building. Naturally, the two would be dressed in, quote, straight clothes in order to blend in with the crowd. Near the end of the movie, one of the two would go into the washroom and assemble the bomb. The device, including a burning cigarette, would be placed inside a paper bag, then carried out of the theater when the movie was over. It was a 2-minute walk from the theater to the alley beside the police building. Many other people would cut through the alley to get to the parking lot. On the way down the alley, the person selected would place the paper bag containing the bomb in the doorway on the side of the building and leave. I objected to leaving the bomb on the side of the building. We'll blow out the Red Barn restaurant, this is Larry speaking, maybe even kill a few innocent customers, and most of them are black. He's speaking to Bill Ayers. Ayers didn't appreciate my remark, and he says, we can't protect all the innocent people in the world. Some will get killed. Some of us will get killed. We have to accept that fact. That bomb is going to be placed on the side of the building. He glared at me for questioning his authority, and then, asks him more questions. So that's what his response was when Larry pointed that out. And of course, Larry saved those lives, many of them black, by telling the FBI, and of course they dismantled that bomb. It never went off. So anyway, what Bill Ayers says there, again, doesn't sound like someone who's devoted to trying to change America for the better. Okay, so as much as these narratives, and they're frequent in the media, try to portray the Weather Underground and other terroristic groups as being misguided but good in motive, that is not the case. There are untold stories of good, decent people who did their duty, who came from the working class. One of them was Larry Grathwohl. You will not, though, find his materials in the curriculum. He was trying to, sort of get the word out, but he is called a gadfly for doing that. So students will not hear about these efforts. They will not hear about who Bill Ayers really was, that he did not care. This is truly a case of black lives don't matter, at least to Bill Ayers. They did not matter to him. They were expendable. Larry wrote reports. He provided testimony. There's still an open case on a police sergeant who was killed by a bomb in San Francisco in 1970. That's never been solved. He was testifying against that several years ago. He wrote a report, White Reds Exploiting Blacks, the Weather Underground, Barack Obama, and the Fundamental Transformation of the United States. So we're talking about, what can we do? I, like Doris, become enraged whenever I hear this respect given to these people who have not changed. They haven't changed. They just got tenure. They're collecting pensions from the state. They're continuing to collect honoraria for their speeches. They're going to campuses, and they're still speaking. One of the latest things was that I saw today, and I follow education and the Department of Education missives, and it just can drive you crazy. It's like, will they ever stop? Is that, anything going to be anything too outrageous? And one of the things they're doing is they said that every high school is getting a copy of the movie Selma, and which is fine to see the movie, but it's being used as a teaching tool, and there, as many historians have pointed out, there are historical inaccuracies there, and the director admits she took liberties. But nonetheless, she says that movies like hers are empathy machines. So the goal here is feelings, empathy, attitudes. What can we do to push against this? I don't know. I would like to could we do a movie about the resistance to the Weather Underground, the other side of the story? What about the people who were affected by this, people who risked their lives, who did it out of altruistic reasons, but others, heroes like Larry and others. But what about those people who were affected? What about the people who were hurt in the bombs? The family members left, who survived. To his credit, he does quote one of the children of a businessman who was killed in an FALN bombing. But it's only one paragraph. But what about their stories? What about the devastated neighborhoods where we have these urban schools, and they're special, there's a specialization in education, where basically students are just indoctrinated? What about the destroyed lives? What about the ruined neighborhoods? People who had to leave their neighborhoods, who didn't feel safe, who lost money. There needs to be a narrative about that. And it needs to be realistic. One of the things I think that is in our favor against some of these propagandistic works about the Weather Underground, they're so self-inflating and so self-congratulatory. But realistic portrayals of the other side. Curriculum materials. Libraries. In Clinton, New York, we have this little tiny library, and I went in and looked at the magazines, and of course they had Mother Jones, The Nation, all the far left magazines, but not National Review, not the Weekly Standard, not Commentary, none of those. And I still need to follow up, but I asked the librarian, who makes the decisions? Well, the director. But I thought, there are school kids coming there maybe to do research. They don't even have exposure to the other side. So I think people need to start paying attention to the curriculum. When PBS sends out these propagandistic movies and lesson plans about the 1960s, those are our tax dollars. We have a right to say, wait a minute, get some other materials in here, and to just get the word out, and to add to the outrage about Bill Ayers whenever he goes to speak. I hope that people will become aware of what he's done to education. His influence is felt far and wide. It's not quite as obvious, and I'm glad that Doris said that I should be on Fox News. I'd gladly go on there, but I slogged through all of Bill Ayers' stuff, not all of it, but most of it, to get a sense of what his education philosophy is, and it's still to tear down this country, to destroy it, to institute a communist regime, and he's all the more able to do it when people give him respect. And I just hope to keep spreading the message that he does not deserve the respect. He may not have gone to jail as he deserved, but we should at least not be respecting him and giving him credit for being an educator. So, thank you.